Hello, bonjour, marhaba. Welcome to our conversation today, Lessons from Palestine, Policing, Prisons and Surveillance and Resistance. This webinar is hosted by Labor for Palestine, a pan-Canadian network of labor activists who work to deepen solidarity with Palestine, Palestinian workers, and people in the struggle for liberation. Please check out Labor for Palestine on social media for more information and stay tuned for their events and actions. Our interpreters are from Co-op Largo, and those of you who are listening to the French interpretation, please mute the original audio on your Zoom to be able to listen to your language interpretation. Today, we have three amazing panelists that have joined us. They're powerful activists and leaders from Palestine, and they're going to speak to us about how the Israeli state, military, and private sector are developing, promoting, and training in technologies and techniques of control, surveillance, and repression. These security technologies, products, and techniques have serious implications for workers' rights, immigration, and prison justice globally. They are tested on Palestinians before being marketed to other governments, police, military, and security forces, including those military, police, and security forces in the US and Canada. This conversation is timely as we are seeing uprisings against racism and state violence in the US and elsewhere renewed and revived, and concerns that are articulating that and speaking about the reach and spread of surveillance and policing responses in addition to the COVID-19 pandemic. It is no coincidence that powerful statements of solidarity with Black liberation and Black communities against racial injustice have come from movements in Palestine and the solidarity movement from across the world. Also, COVID-19 has provided a new opportunity for further expansion and normalization of securitization and the marketing of Israeli military security products at the same time as reinforcing militarism and colonial state violence against Palestinians. And so therefore, it's really important to also amplify and coordinate the resistance. Before moving to hear from our esteemed speakers this afternoon, I would like for us to take just a moment to remember the names and say the names of Ahmed Erakat and Iyad Halek. Ahmed was a 27-year-old Palestinian man that was killed by Israeli occupation forces 4 days ago en route to his sister's wedding. Iyad Halek was a 32-year-old Palestinian man with autism from Jerusalem who was shot and murdered in a similar way. Their murders have caused outrage all over occupied Palestine and other parts of the world. Since 2020, 25 Palestinians have been killed by the occupation forces, and this escalated violence has intensified amid the ongoing and impeding de jure annexation of large swaths of occupied Palestine. My name is Chani Desai, the moderator for this afternoon's webinar. Our speakers today are going to be speaking for 15 minutes each, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A and discussion. For those of you listening, we really encourage you to send in your questions via the chat format and throughout the conversation. That way we can compile them and have them ready for the Q&A. And so without further ado, let's move on to our speakers. Our first speaker today is Ria El Sana, who is the research coordinator at Who Profits Research Center. Our second speaker is Sahar Francis, General Director of Ramallah-based Adamir Prisoner Support and Human Rights Association. And our third speaker is Yafa Jarar, a Palestinian labor lawyer living in Ottawa, an organizer in the BDS movement, and the daughter of Khalida Jarar, an elected member of the Palestinian Legislative Council, who is currently a political prisoner in Daman Israeli prison. So thank you for being here, all three of you. We're really looking forward to hearing your insights and your thoughts on this topic. Without further ado, Rhea, if you'd like to begin, that would be wonderful.
I've unmuted myself. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for having me and everyone for joining in. I hope everyone's well and in good health. I will be talking a little bit about Israel's technological sector, or what we could call tech sector, how it's been involved in the response to COVID-19, but also how COVID-19 and the current moment is being used by Israel's tech sector and military sector as an opportunity. So that's kind of, I'll kind of try to touch upon all of these elements, and then we can, of course, continue the conversation in the Q&A. And the current moment on a global scale, we have seen how states are exploiting this moment to entrench, normalize, and introduce new forms of surveillance and population control. And while some companies are mitigating the financial losses on the back of workers, others are, of course, vowing to generate enormous profits from the current moment. And the Israeli settler colonial project and its military and tech industry are no exception. So, for example, the repressive securitized permit regime that many probably already know about for Palestinians, any Palestinian wanting to enter into Palestine 48 has to have a permit to do so. And importantly, workers have to have work permits to enter into work in Palestine 48 or the settlements. It's around 133,000 Palestinian workers from the West Bank that work in the Israeli economy, forming around 18% of the West Bank's labor force. And this process is already a very heavily securitized process, but COVID was seen as an opportunity kind of to up the level of securitization and infringement on Palestinian rights more generally, and workers in particular. To apply for a permit, Palestinians would go to an office of Israeli civil administration. There's a number of offices in the occupied West Bank. During COVID, these offices were closed, and and everybody was asked to either apply for new permits or to check the validity of the current permits through an app. To complete the installation of this application, an individual had to willingly give the Israeli military access to their phones and all data that is transmitted through their phone. And importantly, to give them access also to the camera and to record sounds and so on. And the military has the hand to use this in any way they see that they see fit. So that's on kind of a very micro level of an issue that has happened, but also from the onset of the crisis, Israel started marketing itself as leading the technological response to the crisis. And Israel's technological response is primarily led by military companies, and the whole of Israel's military infrastructure was mobilized to respond and to manage the crisis. So we saw the Mossad being involved in kind of procuring medical equipment from an international level, sometimes stealing them. We saw the Shin Bet, Israel's internal security service, utilizing technology and tools that it already had for kind of COVID-19 patient tracing. So while everybody was kind of talking about developing that form of technology, Israel already had that on hand, and it had already been using it against Palestinians on both sides of the Green Line. And so the kind of bringing that technology, and it's called the tool, which is basically a massive database gathering system. The Mossad was very unhappy about bringing this form of technology to the public sphere, but it was done in order to promote Israeli companies and their abilities. So now, for example, the Israeli company NSO Group that is involved has a portfolio of human rights violation on a global scale, is involved in developing technology based on the tool and selling various countries around the world. The Israeli Military Research Directorate, which develops weapons and technology for the Israeli military, was put in charge of the technological response. It created a framework that brought together Israel's biggest military companies, so Elbit, Rafael, Israeli Aerospace Industries, and so on, with health tech companies, bringing them together to develop joint projects. This was a way for the Israeli military companies to diversify their product offering, but also to kind of frame themselves as do-gooders. We don't only produce weapons of mass destruction and murder, but we also produce ventilators and things that bring life to people. And this was very clear, and I want to give a quote from Israel, from the Government Companies Authority, the director of the Government Companies Authority, and he said, there are two kinds of industries that there's big money. The industries developing means to kill people, and the industries developing means to save them. And now Israeli military companies want to be able to do both of these things. So Elbit, for example, Elbit Systems, with a fully owned subsidiary of Israeli Aerospace Industries, is developing a remote patient monitoring system. This system is based on its radar and optic system that is used in drones and in other products that they produce. AnyVision is involved in producing thermal cameras. So that's one level. So Israeli military companies involved in diversifying their products, and suddenly they're involved in the health, kind of how we deal with our health. But on the other level, Israeli military and tech companies also vowing to generate profit from what they traditionally kind of generate profit from. And a recent tender that was published by CBAT, which is the International Defense Cooperation Directorate of the Israeli Ministry of Defense. It's basically a body that is designed to showcase Israeli technology on a global scale. Gives us a sense of where these companies are seeing themselves and how they're looking to generate profit. And they published, and recently they published a tender. And the tender is quite interesting. It talks very clearly about the post-COVID reality as being a moment of economic crisis, and where there will be resistance on a global scale, and where states will need to manage, control their resisting populations. And Israel is there to offer them what they need to repress and control people in revolt. There's a recognition that states will spend less money on fighter jets and so on, and will be spending more money on homeland security technology. And so the tender calls for establishing a portfolio for all countries in the world. Like, this is what, so it doesn't matter where, what, except Iran, Syria, and Lebanon, because they're enemy states, and it's not, it's illegal to profit, to trade with them. And the tender calls for creating a portfolio for every country, analyzing its security concerns and needs, identifying potential areas for the export of Israeli equipment and technology, particularly in the field of data, of biometric data collection technology, human and vehicle tracking systems, face recognition, sound and visual detection system, license plate monitoring, cellular and cyber surveillance for intelligence gathering purposes, as well as information blocking and interception. So basically anything that a state needs to repress its population. So the Israeli cyber and artificial intelligence companies that are already generating huge amounts of profit are looking at the post-COVID reality as an opportunity to devour even more profits. I mean, this industry, like if we look at the numbers, for example, Israeli tech companies raised $8.3 billion in capital funding in 2019. The majority of it was by international venture capitalists. And in that sense, the Israeli tech industry is really reliant on the international market. The Israeli market is very small for Israeli tech companies, but it's important. It's what gives them their value in a sense. But they really rely on the international market. So Israeli artificial intelligence companies raised $3.7 billion in 2019. In 2018, 20% of all investment in global investment in cybersecurity companies was done in Israeli cybersecurity companies. Israeli cybersecurity companies export products and services amounting to 6.5 billion on an annual basis. And so, I guess the question is then, how did this become the case? Like, how did Israel become from one of the top 10 weapons exporters in the world and a powerhouse in the field of repressive technology that is exported and used on a global scale? And I guess it's simple, really. I mean, it was said in the introduction, and it's based on Israel's nature as an expansionist settler colonial project that is consistently invested in the subjugation and repression of Palestinians in the interest of its geopolitical project, but also economy. And this tightly knit relationship between the Israeli military and the nature of the Israeli state is what makes this industry so profitable, and is the industry's biggest its biggest asset. So the military functions as a laboratory where any form of violence and any mechanisms of violence and repression can be tested with no limits. The relationship with the military is also a business card for companies. So, you can say that the Israeli military is using this, so it's implemented in real life, and therefore it has been tested. And so there's a higher value for the technology that they produce. So Palestinian refugee camps and Jerusalem in particular have become really sites to develop and perfect urban warfare mechanisms, counterinsurgency technology, and Jerusalem really has become a showroom for Israeli surveillance technology and policing, with police from all over the world flocking into Jerusalem to learn Israeli police how to manage populations and how to repress, survey population densely in urban spaces. Jerusalem has become such an important space, a marketing space for these companies, that companies are even offering their services free of charge. And this is not just Israeli companies. So for example, Cisco Systems, an American company that does kind of a lot of good work around the world to clear its name. But it, for example, offered the municipality of Jerusalem to implement a surveillance project implementing face recognition technology, sound detection, and so on, free of charge. Why did Cisco do this? Because Cisco knows that if it says, well, the system that I'm selling you now has already been implemented in Jerusalem, this immediately raises the profile of its technology that it's offering. Gaza, beyond being a ground for testing kind of hard military, where it's also become the wall built around Gaza and the underwater wall built in the sea, as well as the wall in the West Bank and so on, have become a case to showcase border control technology. The repressive permit system and checkpoints themselves have also become a showcase for biometric system technology, for airport technology, and so on. So every mechanism of repression is also a mechanism of marketing for Israeli companies. And importantly also, and this is important, the more that we're going to see kind of Israeli tech companies being involved in other spheres and not just necessarily kind of the direct ones that we would resist against, is that the Israeli military, that there is no way of separating Israel's tech sector, no matter what they produce, even if it's company like Wix that does online website development. It's kind of one of the biggest companies. Everybody uses it without realizing. But there's no way of talking about any of that without it being linked and related to and based on military technology. The military as a structure is the incubator for Israeli technological innovation, and the one that generates the Israeli tech workforce. So soldiers that finish their years of service, they go on to privatize the knowledge that they have acquired and learned through years of repression and violence, and they sell it on the private market. Around 7,500 soldiers graduate on an annual basis from the military's computer. There's a special school in the military that soldiers train in before they enter into any of the units. So people may know 8,200, 9,000, Lotem, and so on. But before you enter into any of these divisions, you have to go through the school. And 7,500 of those graduate on an annual basis. So it just gives us a sense of how much the Israeli military the militarism and securitization forms the basis of this sector, no matter what it is that they are producing. And I guess at this moment, as is Israel and its companies look at mechanisms of exporting their technology and how kind of broadening the remit of their technology and broadening the remit of their exports and profits, that is essentially tested, perfected, and used against Palestinian bodies here, but it doesn't stay here. It's developed here, but its usability here is also a marketing for the global market. And particularly at the current moment when similarities can be drawn between different lived experiences, I think it's useful for us to try and move beyond analogies and similarities. So it's tear gas here, tear gas there, it's all tear gas, so it's all the same. And identify and look more towards identifying material connections, shared logics, and develop a better understanding of the way in which technology, capital, and narratives move between repressive regimes in the kind of interest of their political projects, but also in the interest of their in their economic interest as well. And I hope I didn't take too long.
No, you didn't. Thank you. That was incredibly insightful, and just hearing about the way these companies and the weapons industry is entrenching itself in this moment is frightening and important for us as activists to also know, because I think, you know, as you're saying, making the material connections in this moment is really important beyond analogy. So thank you for that, and we'll definitely have questions for you in the Q&A. Thanks, Ria. So next, Sahar, if you want to just go ahead. Thank you for being here.
Thanks a lot. And it's really very, very important subject and very interesting. Thanks, Raya, for this amazing presentation, because I think it's very, very important to highlight that this Israeli technology that was used and experienced on the Palestinian society in different levels for so many decades. It didn't started actually with COVID-19. If we take the issue of the prisoners, it's a very powerful example for how Israel developed techniques of torture for more than 50 years, and they were teaching the other world, especially in the United States context, how to use methods of torture without leaving marks on the body, without being able to prove that someone was tortured, how to switch between the physical torture and the psychological torture, and abuse all detainees' rights, and still claim that this is done in the name of security and to face terrorists and all this paradigm that was developed after September 11th in the American context, and then was sold out to the world for and in the name of fighting terrorism globally. I mean, but let me, since like it's about the COVID-19 lately, I think that again, if we take the issue of the prisoners, it was really very, like, not surprising, but amazing how again and again, every time Israel prove that they are very clever with using technology in oppressing the prisoners. Because like in the time of the COVID, the UN, different special rapporteurs, including the High Commissioner for Human Rights, requested not just Israel specifically, but all states in the world to release prisoners, as the prisoners would be very unprotected group that would be really infected a lot if the COVID-19 reach prisons. So in Israel, instead of taking this note and releasing Palestinian prisoners, especially those categories that fits in the most risk, that they would be under immediate risk on their life, like old prisoners, sick prisoners, children, or those that they suffer from very serious diseases. Like very few prisoners suffer from cancer, from heart attack, very serious issues. Instead of releasing these prisoners and enabling more space for the prisoners in the different sections where the Palestinian prisoners are held, they intensified the arrest campaigns. Like ironically, under the blockade, when in Israel and in the occupied people were requested to stay at home and are like locked down, the Israeli army, the Israeli occupation forces never stopped invading the Palestinian cities on daily basis and arresting more and more people. Like the statistics are still around like 4,700, 5,000 Palestinian prisoners, out of them around 39 female prisoners, 270, 250 Palestinian children under 18, but we have around 700 Palestinian prisoners that they are sick. They suffer from different chronic diseases or more serious diseases. Unfortunately, we don't have a very exact statistics about how many they are old, like let's say over 60. But what happened immediately after enforcing the closure of the prisons, because immediately when Israel started dealing with COVID-19, they declared again the emergency situation, especially for the COVID-19, because the whole state is still under emergency situation since 48, which means they can regulate laws under this emergency circumstances. But here, in this special case, they enabled the head of the prison system to close totally all the prisons, which means they canceled immediately all the family visits. They canceled all the lawyers' visits, and they totally disconnected the Palestinian prisoners from their families. Because, and here I would highlight in the Palestinian prisoners' case, the apartheid system that actually is used. Because, and against laborers as well. Thanks, Raya, for mentioning the Palestinian permit system, that is Palestinian laborers actually are requested to request before entering to work in Israel. But in all the different with all the different groups, there's always a policy of an apartheid and serious discrimination, even in such serious cases with healthcare crisis, that obviously they shouldn't discriminate between prisoners, for example, or laborers based on their ethnicity origins. So in the prisoners' case, the Israeli prisoners were able to phone and to contact and to communicate with their families in these serious crises every day, because they have public phones in their sections, where all the 5,000 Palestinian prisoners, they were totally disconnected, knowing nothing about what's going on with their families, or they cannot inform their families what's their health conditions. And especially because we lawyers and organizations, we were not able to enter to the prisons. And we needed, like human rights organizations, Palestinian organizations, and Israeli organizations, we were petitioning the Israeli High Court in late March. We filed the petition against these security regulations, claiming that they cannot totally close the prisons and they cannot totally disconnect the prisoners from their families. Till today, there's no final decision by the court. For more than 2 months and a half, the court was delaying the sessions, enabling the state to answer every time and to give explanations why they cannot give phone calls. And it was so annoying in the first court session when we were arguing that at least you should enable them to call their families. And really the judges, they were asking, what about calls to the lawyers as well? Like how you can arrest someone, prosecute him, and continue, because I will explain again how they continued with the legal procedures in the military courts as well under these security provisions. And you expect to to trial someone without enabling him to have legal counseling. And what the prosecutor of the state was saying, we cannot control the phone calls with the lawyers. And I was shocked, like he's a lawyer representing the state. He totally, when it comes for the Palestinian prisoners' cases, he's not thinking about the privacy and the ethics of the legal representation, that a conversation between the lawyer and his client should be totally secret. Like, how come you claim that we are not enabling phone calls between lawyers and Palestinian prisoners because we wouldn't be able to hear every word that is said there? But still, the court didn't give a very clear decision on this. And actually, later they enabled us to get phone calls just with prisoners that they have a hearing scheduled in 14 days from the call that we requested as lawyers. So all those that they are sentenced, they were not having this like right to contact and communicate with their lawyers. And also when they enabled as an exception the children and the female prisoners, and I'm sure that Yafa later will explain more about Khalida's case, but it was very important that Khalida was the only and one of three female prisoners. They enabled actually all the female prisoners to call their families, except Khalida and other two female prisoners. One of them, Mais Abu Ghosh, was tortured very severely over the summer in 2019, and she was filing a complaint against this torture as well. And we needed again to petition the Israeli district court in order to claim, like, how come Khalida was able to visit her family before the COVID-19? She wasn't punished with canceling family visits before the COVID-19 for security reasons. So what's the claim now that for security reasons, you cannot enable her to contact her family? So just after the pressure of the court, they enabled Khalida out. Actually, they enabled them before reaching the day of the discussion in the court, enabled the three of them. all the other like adult male prisoners, part of them they were able to contact their family so far, and part of them no. 2 weeks ago, they reactivated the family visits for Palestinians from Jerusalem and Palestinian citizens of the state of Israel, not yet for Palestinians from the West Bank. And with all the limitations, they also enabled the lawyer's visit. We are able to visit one prisoner in each visit, and just for 1 hour. So we cannot request 4 prisoners or 5 prisoners, and imagine visiting 5,000 prisoners, how long it will take. Going back to the court procedures, and this is very important, they were taking the advantage of the COVID-19 circumstances, and at the beginning they totally canceled the court sessions, and slowly, because they kept arresting people, at the end of the day, they cannot justify having people without being present to the court. So they invented this court sessions via the technology, Zoom, not Zoom actually, but they have their own system how to connect between the prisons and the court sessions. And we were starting to see the detainees, instead of bringing the detainee to the court, to have the court session done over the video call. And imagine that you have to meet a detainee that he was just arrested lately, and you have to give him advice over the interrogation in the, and they claimed that no one would be present with the detainee on the other side, and we can request the judge and the prosecutor to leave the room and to have the conversation alone. But with all what Rhea was describing about the whole technologies that they use in order to listen to every conversation, whether over phones or mobiles, the Facebook, the social media, all of the other tools that we use, actually they are under their control. And this is, we can confirm from the daily cases we represent in the military court over incitement, for example, because you dared to write a message or a post or anything in your Twitter, social media, WhatsApp, Signal, or whatever. Everything could be, it's not a secret that the cyber unit that Rhea was mentioning, it was the special unit that they were really using in so many cases, the information and the data that they collected from this unit in at least the 5-6 years, in hundreds of cases that they were submitted to the military court against Palestinian journalists, student activists, politicians, and everyone that dared to criticize or to write anything in his social media supporting the Palestinian movement and resisting the occupation. And I would like, so now what the serious thing that they try, like they extended the security and the emergency regulations for 3 months, but according to the Israeli law, they cannot extend it more. So what they are trying to do now, to go to the Knesset, to get it as like a law for 1 year, that they can actually keep with these procedures, that without bringing the prisoners to the courts, they can do the sessions over the video calls, or they can declare about closing the prisons anytime that they have a medical suspect that there's a need to close in order to protect the prisoners from being infected with the virus. Another note on the labor's issues. Like, you know, in Israel, when they asked or they enforced the blockade and the lockdown for all the people, the Palestinian laborers as well were included. Like most of the Palestinian laborers were stuck inside Israel, but they couldn't go to work because they were, and imagine that they were sleeping and staying in their construction sites in very bad conditions, not just this, the discrimination, and the very huge discrimination was on the level of the insurance and the security that the state afforded for their own citizens, that you are not working, but you could register to get a compensation from the state, where it was denied totally for the Palestinian laborers, even for those that they were having the special permit and working legally inside Israel. They couldn't requested compensation for these 2 months or 3 months. They were kicked out without anything. Now, for example, this week they declared, because there's an increase in the cases both in the occupied territories and inside Israel, the Israeli state requested the Palestinian laborers, everyone that wants to enter to work inside Israel, he couldn't leave before 3 weeks. He have to stay in Israel for 3 weeks. If he leave, he's not allowed to go back to work, and he will lose his permit. So actually, they're using all these techniques in order, yes, I will be summarizing. So I mean, the case of the prisoners is really reflecting how these technologies that usually is used in order to enforce repression and to control. And the main idea is how to control populations is really used in the Palestinian context, in all of the villages that they have the weekly demonstrations and against settlements, in the checkpoints. Like, can you imagine the checkpoint system, all these data collection techniques, and how biometric systems, how it was developed through all these years of implementing the checkpoint system in the occupied territories in order to be used later. So I think it's very, very important to highlight the urgency of activists being associated with the PDS movement, with the call for divestment and sanctions against all these companies, Israelis and international partners, that they are really profiting from all this occupation policies in the occupied territories. Thank you.
Thank you, Sahar, for providing a really, you know, a deep update on what's happening, particularly in this moment, as you know, the Israeli state is using COVID to further entrench surveillance, but also the carceral regime in a way that removes people's and takes away people's rights. We want to hear more about also the labor situation, and so I'll return to that in a moment. But you've left so much for us to think about around what needs to be done in this moment, as prisoners are inside without the ability to reach their families, not knowing what the conditions might be, and what violations like torture are taking place inside the prison. So thank you again for the update, but also the work that you do, and you know, without further ado, Yafa, if you can talk about your mother, since Sahar has gestured to what's happening with her in the prison.
And thank you, Sahar, thank you, Leah, and thank you, Labor for Palestine. Thank you for having me, everybody attending this discussion with us today. First of all, I'd like to say that I'm speaking with you today from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And I always start by saying that we cannot talk about Palestine or Palestinian political prisoners from here without the full commitment to the struggle and resistance of Indigenous peoples here in Canada, and without also acknowledging the political prisoners and land defenders who have been and continue to be incarcerated because of their fight against settler colonialism and settler colonial policies here. But we're also speaking today during an uprising for Black liberation in North America and around the world to end systemic racism, anti-Blackness and anti-Blackness policies, police violence and brutality criminalization and systemic incarceration, systemic murder of Black lives. As Palestinians or as advocates for Palestinian rights, we must be in solidarity with the struggle for Black lives, and we must learn how to be active allies in the struggle. We must remember that as Palestinians around the world are experiencing a trauma response to what is happening to our Black sisters and brothers, that we also know how to meaningfully stand in solidarity, and must only draw parallels when our struggles, when it's useful to do so, but also by being careful about how we draw the parallels, must listen, learn, and work with and under the direction of Black people who are leading the struggle. So today I'm particularly speaking about my mother, but if time permits, Chenny, and we'll see how Q&A goes, I would like to also speak a little bit about the links between Canada's public and private sector to the security apparatus used by Israel today. So we'll see how that goes. Today, my mother, Khalid Jarrar, sits in a cell in Damun Zionist Israeli prison, as Sahar explained. And so far, she has been not charged yet. Since end of October of 2019, when they arrested her, her military courts kept being postponed. The last one was just in June, and that was postponed as well. And the next court order will be in July 13th. So she sits there along with roughly 39, and Sahar can confirm the numbers because they change almost every day. So as of June, according to Adamir, along with 39 other women prisoners held in Israeli prisons and detention centers, including 16 mothers, again, roughly number plus minus 1 or 2, 8 injured prisoners, 12 sick prisoners, and 4 administrative detainees held without charge or trial. My mom was arrested actually for the very first time on International Women's Day March in Palestine in 1989, along with 4 of her sisters. So this is not a new thing for us, and certainly not a new thing for Palestinians in general. Since 2015, she has been arrested 3 times. And I'm looking at some of my notes, and it says, refer to notes and go through dates, because we lost count of the dates and the numbers, and the dates of every arrest and the dates of every violation that has been done. So I have to keep it in an updated Word document and refer to it as we go, which in itself made me think a little bit about the impact of imprisonment in general. And I just want to say that imprisoning Palestinians is it's not only the act of confining the freedom of that one person who is imprisoned. It is an Israeli systemic policy to also punish the families of those prisoners. It is, in a way, one can argue, a form of torture that extends beyond the prisoner itself, to keep the families living under continuous fear, uncertainty, on edge, not knowing what's going on, going through permits and long hours of humiliating and harsh travel conditions. And then after that, to be heavily searched and questioned and interrogated before even arriving to the room where you will be separated by thick glass to visit with your family member over a phone, or phones that some of them don't even work properly. And while fully armed Israeli soldiers are over our shoulders and the shoulders of the prisoner, as well as Sahar described about the surveillance of any type of communication. Listening to that, perhaps intimate visitation with prisoners that last 45 minutes, and sometimes the visits that it takes for families to get to their prisoners takes more than 12 hours. And that's not because of distance. That's because of an intentional punishment placed by Israel that will only permit us to go through the Red Cross buses to get to visitations, and have to go through all of the searches and stops and humiliation. There are many political prisoners whom their elderly parents simply are not able. If you are elderly, if you have any form of physical disability, you cannot really go through that trip. And therefore, some families don't end up visiting their children in or their family members inside prison simply for that reason. There's absolutely no reason for that except to punish the families of prisoners. Not this time, but the time before in 2015 when my mom was arrested, again, we lost track of the times. But that time in particular, you know, and when they raid with numbers. They raid the house at very late hours, early morning hours, and they raid in numbers very violently. My sister Suha was sleeping along, and our cat was in the house as well. And they raided and took mom, but also tortured Suha in the process. My sister, who was sleeping, who woke up to armed soldiers pointing guns at her, tied her up without clothing, and refused to even give her water. So she woke up very confused under those circumstances. And this is just one level that adds to the whole. Mom was taken away from the house, not knowing what happened to my sister behind. And it took us days before we could even know where mom was. So this is just to give an example as to the impact of all of that, even the act of arrest itself. When you have 60 fully armed soldiers raiding a house to arrest my mother, who is a human rights advocate, you know, the fact that they feel that threatened, that they need this amount of force and violence to do that. So October 31st of 2019, when fully armed soldiers raided our home in Ramallah, as I mentioned, to arrest my mom, mom would have spent around about 3.5 years in Israeli prisons in total. And the Zionist state is so afraid, as I mentioned, of her because of her role as a feminist, as a human rights defender, as a leader that people look up to and respect in Palestine. They don't want that. That to them is threatening, and that's enough. That's enough for them to criminalize Palestinians and to justify their imprisonment. I would like just to bring some attention to stories of resistance from inside prison to illustrate as an example of resilience and resistance that those incarcerated practice every day. While in prison, my mom has played a major role in educating and teaching the women and girls who are in there. She has started educational programs so that they can get their high school diploma from inside prison. And recently, my understanding is that they were approved also to be doing BA university level programs from inside there. So from inside prison, my mother sent a message urging people around the world to carry and communicate the stories of Palestinian prisoners so that someday the walls of every prison may come tumbling down, ushering in the age of Palestinian freedom. In her own words, my mom says in Ramzi Baroud's latest book, which is called These Chains Will Be Broken, Palestinian Stories and Struggle and Defiance in Israeli Prisons. Mom wrote the foreword in that book, and I would like just to honor that by reading some of the foreword written by my mom. And she says, "Prison is not just a place made of high walls, barbed wire, and small suffocating cells with heavy iron doors. It is not just a place that is defined by the clanking sound of metal. Indeed, the screeching or slamming of metal is the most common sound you will hear in prisons. Whenever heavy doors are shut, when heavy beds or cupboards are moved, when handcuffs are locked in position or loosened, and even the bosta, the notorious vehicle that transports Palestinian prisoners from one prison facility to another, are metal beasts. Their interior, their exterior, even their doors are built in shackle. No, prison is more than all of this. It is also stories of real people, daily suffering and struggles against the prison guards and administration. Prison is a moral position that must be made daily and can never be put behind you. Prison is comrades, sisters, brothers, who with time grow closer to you than your own family. It is common agony, pain, sadness, and despite everything, also joy at times. In prison, we challenge the abusive prison guard together with the same will and determination to break him so that he does not break us. This struggle is unending and is manifested in every possible form, from the simple act of refusing our meals to confining ourselves to our rooms, to the most physically and psychologically vigorous of all efforts, the open hunger strike. These are but some of the tools which Palestinian prisoners use to fight for and earn their very basic right and to preserve some of their dignity. Prison is the art of exploring possibilities. It is a school that trains you to solve daily challenges using the simplest and most creative means, whether it be food preparation, mending old clothes, or finding common ground so that we may all endure and survive together. In actuality, these are not just prison stories. For Palestinians, the prison is a microcosm of the much larger struggle of a people who refuse to be enslaved on their own land and who are determined to regain their freedom with the same will and vigor carried by all once colonized nations. The suffering and the human rights violations experienced by Palestinian prisoners, which run contrary to international and humanitarian law, are only one side of the prison story. The other side can only be truly understood and conveyed by those who have lived these harrowing experiences. Here, you can imagine what it feels like to lose a loving mother while being confined to a small cell, how to deal with a broken leg, to be left without family visitation for years at a time, to be denied your right to education, and to cope with the death of a comrade. While you will learn of the numerous acts of physical torture, psychological torment, and prolonged isolation, you will also discover the power of the human will. When men and women decide to fight back, to reclaim their natural rights, and to embrace their humanity. Indeed, these are the stories of men and women who have collectively decided never to break, no matter how great the pressure and the pain. I would like to conclude by bringing that same philosophy and message of solidarity and resilience and resistance amongst us living here, and in particular, those of us who are part of the labor movement. I want us all to remember that speaking truth to power, that being on the right side of history, and showing our unwavering commitment to the principles is exactly how we can win and further our struggle for freedom and dignity. The racist Zionist lobby does not and must not scare us. We will continue the struggle, all of us, until all political prisoners are free, until apartheid is dismantled, until Palestine is free. We have the most powerful of tools to do that, and that is the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. We must engage it. We must use it. We cannot wait for politicians to do that work for us. We have to engage it, and we have to force it to become the mainstream and the reality. It is no longer sufficient to just condemn the occupation. That is not enough. Israel clearly doesn't care about that. And Palestinians are tired of having to celebrate a few words that come just to show a false sense of support. For our labor unions to only organize trips to Palestine without tying it directly to an action plan after the visit is not enough. Most importantly, for labor unions to organize trips and also meet with Israel's Histadrut, a racist and Zionist labor union, is simply not acceptable. We need to engage the actual practices and to hold Israel accountable. Thank you.
Ding, 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 ding.
Thank you, Yafa. Again, for incredibly powerful words from prison, from your mother's writings, and a call to the labor movement on their responsibilities, and And it's not just about, symbolic gestures and visiting and seeing what's happening, but, what are the politics and what are we doing in relation to organizing and solidarity and actual material change. So actually, to return to or to go to the Q&A, I want to actually transition to some of the pieces that have come up in the conversation. Yafa, I will bring it back to you in a moment to speak about the public-private sector that we need to talk about. But maybe, if Ria and Sahar, if we can, if you can tell us a little bit more about the labor situation and what has been happening and in the COVID moment, but also the mechanisms that are enhancing the exploitation of Palestinian labor in this moment, would be really insightful if you can provide more, because a lot of the people listening today are also from trade unions. And so it might be helpful to, if you can speak to that a little bit as the first question. Sahar, would you like to?
Sorry. Rhea, I will leave for you all the part about the details of the conditions of the labors and the practical things, because who profits is really following these cases. I can add on the legal aspects about the rights of these laborers and how they treat them legally. Like, it's very important to highlight this permit system that Israel imposed actually on the Palestinian laborers since 93 actually, after the Oslo agreement, and they use it as a way how to criminalize these labors. The problem here that, imagine these people, they for some reasons, and mostly not reasons that they can defend or they can argue against, because it's based on secret information, they will not be granted permits by the civil administration. So they would be enforced to sneak into Israel in different ways to work without a permit. If they would be captured, they would be imprisoned. They would be trialed in the military court. Imagine, Israel, I think, is the only state that is using military court system against civilians in such a manner and a widespread way, because hundreds of Palestinian workers every year, they would be prosecuted and sentenced for a couple of months, beside the fines. Like, the amazing thing about the military court system is the issue of the fines. The amount of money that Palestinian society is paying for this military system, and people can think that it's mostly because of the security cases. No, at all. Every year, out of the 10,000 cases that we follow in the military courts, more than 50%, even around 60%, 60+% would be cases of either laborers that they entered without a permit, or traffic issues like car accidents or violations of traffic laws that they have to pay as well fines in the military court. So the laborers were suffering under the COVID-19, not just the threat that you enter Israel in such a very emergency situation of health, serious health conditions. You could be imprisoned. If you don't reach the work, you will not get the money to get back to your family. Thousands of families that they rely on the work of these laborers on daily basis, they were left without anything. In these months, their beloved were not able to work properly in these 3 months. And as I said before, the state wasn't taking care about these people, no. And in the same time, we all know about this issue of holding the money by the PA I mean by the Israelis, this money that the Israelis deducting from the salaries of the laborers, plus the money from the taxation on the products and so on, that is supposed to be transferred for the Palestinian Authority on monthly basis, that was not transferred for several months now, more than 7 months. So I mean, the labor really face an exploitation in a very serious manner under the Israeli system. And this is why the unions all over, the labor unions, should be, as Yafa said, it's not enough to condemn the occupation anymore. Definitely not. With the annexation now, I mean, really, the Palestinians are tired that we like tried to struggle in every way that we can, and especially on the UN system, we feel this hypocrisy of the double standard as well in implementing international law. And this is why we refer to the people, because I believe the power is with the people. We can bring the change. We shouldn't just wait for the states to take decisions, political decisions in the UN or in other platforms to enforce Israel to abide to international law. We should find the way how to find Israel accountable for all these crimes that they are committing on a daily basis.
Ria, there's a question for you specifically about if you could speak to the situation of labor and the Histadrut in the current moment. And if you can elaborate on that.
Sorry, Palestinian, the relationship between the Histadrut and Palestinian labor? Is that what you mean? Okay, so so the Histadrut, in theory, the Histadrut is the trade union that under which Palestinian laborers in the Israeli market are unionized. That is not Palestinian workers in the illegal settlements, but only laborers that are in that work within Palestine 48. The trade union dues are deducted from wages, from workers' wages. They have no right of determining what trade union they belong to. So in clear violation of workers' rights to choose kind of their trade union, they're forced to pay trade union dues to the Histadrut. And the Histadrut has done practically nothing over the years in defense of Palestinian labor or in protection of Palestinian labor. As Yafa was mentioning earlier, the Histadrut is not your typical trade union body. The Histadrut has always been instrumental in Israel's Zionist colonial project, even before the establishment of the Israeli state. So it's quite farcical that there's kind of an expectation of the Histadrut to be in any shape, way, or form involved in protecting labor rights and labor rights. It goes inherently contradictory to the essence of the Histadrut. And we see that during COVID, no matter how horrible the conditions were, and people have touched upon, I was speaking to a worker in construction sites here in Haifa, where I live, and they were sleeping on construction sites with no utility, no running water, no access to any kind of forms of utility, particularly needed at this current moment. But also, just so you know, that when workers were asked to kind of continue on working in these conditions, their movement is heavily surveyed. So if you're a contractor and you have workers that are staying here and sleeping on your site, they can't really move. Part of the whole process, what happened during COVID, is that these contractors would take workers' IDs away from them. So basically, you're a worker on a construction site. There's nothing for you. There's no social security, there's no protection, and there's very little for you, there's very little abilities for you to kind of protect yourself in any kind of way. And this particularly it was heightened during for the construction sector workers. The majority of Palestinian workers in the Israeli economy work in construction. They generate huge amounts of the construction sector's annual profits. The 66% of the profit generated in the Israeli construction sector is generated on the back of exploiting Palestinian laborers. And so this is why Israel really pushed hard, particularly Israeli contractors. They were fighting with the Israeli government that, okay, you want to enforce closure on the West Bank, do that, but let the workers come and work because we need to make the money. And the way for us to make the money is to continue exploiting Palestinian labor. And so during COVID, the conditions were horrendous. Not only did many Palestinian workers lose their jobs, but exploitation really heightened. And the Histadrut is barely nowhere to be seen. I mean, they haven't said a word, either in criticism or in action or, you know, in any shape or form. Other labor organizations have, for example, gone to court. So Kavla Obed, for example, and the Israelis, they went to court demanding that Israel releases. So Israel has, Sahar was saying about the insurance, Palestinian workers have very limited insurance coverage, but there's a cover, kind of there's a blanket deduction from their wages for insurance that is then meant to be transferred to them. Over the years, this has accumulated to over 500 million Israeli shekels that are basically sitting in these health insurance funds that the Israeli Ministry of Economy controls, and they're not releasing. And so there was a court case to say, well, release these funds to workers that are now not working because of COVID, and that they're in extreme need for, because when you lose a job on the Israeli economy, it's not like you can find a job in the West Bank because people are coming to work in the Israeli economy because there's no jobs in the West Bank. And the state said no. So in reality, the reality that is created also through the mechanisms of Oslo and the Paris Protocol render Palestinian laborers extremely vulnerable with nobody, essentially nobody that is invested in protecting their rights, and certainly not the Histadrut.
Just to follow up on that, one question came in around, you know, are Palestinian workers in Israel obliged to be unionized by the Histadrut?
Yes, you have no choice. Recently, there was in January, during 2019, there were a few kind of cases that have been won around other unions representing Palestinian laborers, but the mass majority, it's still happening through the Histadrut.
Thank you. Yafa, moving to, you know, the private public piece you brought up, could you speak to that? And also, are there specific examples and campaigns for labor unions specifically?
Yeah, thank you, Chani. I also saw Rafif's note in the chat box. To be honest, it has been disappointing, and I am disappointed. And this really, like any campaigns and movement within the labor movement, will have to come from within. Obviously, we all know that. So acting as members of different labor unions, and we all know that you know, QP Ontario and other unions have passed BDS resolutions in the past, in particular ones about academic boycott, etc. But I don't think there are any ongoing active campaigns that are labor focused for BDS. So I think this would be a good time for anybody and everybody who is part of a labor union to join forces with Labor for Palestine and actually start working actively on not only passing resolutions at conventions, but also concrete campaigns that are going to be, so I know that's disappointing, but this is what the reality is. And so back to back to the connecting kind of the Canada's links to security, to Israel's security from both the public and private sector. I think this discussion is historic. It's not a new discussion. It's not a new discovery. There are endless resources out there, reports, books, and what have you, that show the links. However, those links are not always obvious. So we should probably use some of the research that has been available to us, and Ria pointed to some really important points there. But it made me think of 2008 when our friend Kili Barda published, his research on the issue, and basically touched on, and rightfully so, pointed out to the fact that it's not that transparent. It's really difficult to get all this information. And sure it is. So talking about the institutional framework, of course, for Canada-Israel cooperation. And I think finding out these details will make it also a lot easier and better for the labor movement to actually have concrete campaigns, right? Doing internal research as well. But also knowing that these links very much exist already, and they are very strong on so many different levels. A lot of it has been privatized though. So when we go to the Canada government website that prides itself in being transparent, we don't see these numbers there because they're not coming out of public funds per se. They have been privatized and channeled through different ones, right? So, and the research is very misleading sometimes, but again, it's not hard to find. Things such as the Canada-Israel Industrial Research and Development Fund, the Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement, there's so much stuff in there. Canada-Israel Security Ties, Kili back then wrote about specifically the Declaration of Intent and on public safety, specific Canada Homeland Security linkage, right? Like including Canada-Israel military industrial links, for example, Canada and Israel aerospace projects. Some of them Ria mentioned in different contexts, the marine technology development, looking at, if you just look at the latest Department of Foreign Affairs in Canada annual report, and the latest one that they have posted is from 2018. The export value of military goods and technology to Israel in 2018 was close to 16 million. Now, when I first read it, I was like, this doesn't sound like a lot. Like, I thought it was gonna be more. But then I was like, because a lot of it is also happening through private companies, most of it actually. So it wouldn't, of course, be on this list. Looking at a number, Kili also looked at a number of Canadian-based defense industrial producers who are involved in the production of components designed for weapons, platforms in the Israeli military, looking at Canada-Israel defense industrial contracts, including an agreement between Israel, the Israeli-based Elisra Group and the Canadian Army to continue supplying electronic combat systems for helicopter defense, for example. Bombardier, Nortel, right? So we have all of this information, we know it. Looking at the cooperation on the ground in cyberspace, emergency response and riot control, right? Like here we talk about policing. For example, the Quebec-based Mawashi Corporation Protective Clothing, which is a Canadian provider of riot equipment, literally riot police equipment. You go onto their website and you can shop. I mean, I don't know if you can buy it, but like you can really shop for riot equipment that works closely with Israeli distributor called MyForm Personal Security. And then you go to the Israeli distributor's website, MyForm, which is an authorized supplier of Israeli Department of Defense and distributes Mawashi body armor carrying vests, Krav Maga training suits, riot shields, full body protection suits for riots. Their clients include the Israeli Department of Defense, the Israeli PMO, the Israeli prison authorities, IDF special forces, police special forces, and private security firms, okay? So like the links are there, the work is what needs to be done, and how is that connected to, if we are in a certain particular labor union, to our union, where is our pension fund happening? But also even if there aren't direct links, right? There is a responsibility. The JNF, Canada Parks, Independent Jewish Voices has been leading the campaign on that for years. We all know there's an ongoing legal proceeding in regards to that. There is endless amount of information about the direct, this is not even theory, it's like the link is so there obvious in front of us that it's really impossible to ignore unless we insist on ignoring it. So this is more of like directly our, the idea of Canadian contribution to charity, right? And how the apartheid wall plays a role in there too, but also that Canada Parks exist on demolished Palestinian villages and what have you. Yeah, and just a little note about annexation, because somebody brought up, I knew it was going to come up. We must remember it's not an approaching thing; it's an ongoing thing that has started decades ago. Now it's just crystallized more. It's making apartheid a lot clearer, but it's not a new thing. It is, and we must not lose focus and control over the discourse now to just be talking anti-annexation, because it's not an isolated new thing. It's an ongoing crystallization of the so-called peace process, again from 1995, yeah, so I'll stop here because I'm ranting now.
You're never ranting. You're never ranting. Well, because we are about 10 minutes from the close time of the event, I think it might be important to end with some final words. If each of you can just say some final words that might speak specifically to either the importance of BDS in this moment, but also forms of solidarity in terms of connecting connections that movements can make between each other in this moment, as we see the carceral logics, the surveillance logics, and the tech logics connected to each other. So perhaps Sahar, we can start with you, Rhea, and then Yafa with closing words. And then I just want to end with some thank yous and then information. So if we can move to Sahar.
Thanks, and really, it's really very interesting discussion, and really was very good session. Thanks for joining Domir with this. So I think it's very important what Yafa said about making the connections between the prisoners' issues, not just for Palestinian political prisoners, but specifically now with what's going on in the United States and with political prisoners movements in different conflict areas. And this brings me with the campaign that we had a couple of years ago as a PDS campaign in the G4S campaign, the security company, the British Danish security company that was involved in the Israeli prison system, supplying some of the Israeli prisons with security facilities. And actually we succeeded. We succeeded to push them out of the prison system. They didn't left Israel totally, of course, but I mean, this shows how it's very important to make these connections and to learn and to do our own research about the responsibilities of these international corporations, whether on security, whether in weapons, whether in trade, in all of the different issues, because they learn from each other, they support each other, and then we have to struggle and to face them in a coordinated way. This is what gives us power, and this is why I think it's a very important time to think about these connections and these similarities and to strategize together how we are going to face these different international companies that they invest and benefit from the continuity of the Israeli occupation.
Thank you. Rhea?
I want to say first thank you to Yafa and to Sahar and to Tandy for coordinating, and everybody who did work on coordinating this. It was a really informative conversation, and I hope it was useful for everyone out there that we can't we can't see. But yeah, so thanks a lot for that. I guess I'm gonna kind of continue with what Sahar was talking about. I think you know, it day by day, bit by bit, we understand more and more, and it becomes a bit more clearer how capital and power work together and interest on a global scale. Things that happen in one geography are not disconnected from things that happen in other geographies. And they're happening together they're shared on a structural level. There's an institutional coordination that has taken place. There's structures of oppression coordinate with each other on a global scale. And I think we need to kind of be better at identifying how structures of oppression work in tandem, not just in their kind of end result and visibilities, but actually how they systematically work together in a real sense. And to form solidarity on that basis, to form solidarity logic on basis of connecting our struggles, because understanding how they connect together, not because they look similar to each other, or you know, kind of go into kind of performativity of solidarity, but actually understanding what real solidarity means. And real solidarity means breaking the chains of oppression and capital on a global scale, and not just vis-a-vis one particular struggle. So I think there's also a tendency of looking at Palestine as something over there and doing solidarity in a way that is, yeah, performative. And I think being in a structure that is labor, in organized labor, gives people a possibility and an opportunity to think about solidarity in a much more meaningful way, and to think about links of solidarity that actually produce transformation, not just kind of visible transformation on one end or the other, but understanding how transformation takes place on a much more global scale, and it takes place in a way that is actually really connected to each other. So I think, you know, kind of embrace the opportunity that you have of being able to organize and unionize as labor, and kind of take that into hand and see how do we create change in Palestine, but what does that mean also in the reality that you're living in your situation.
Thank you. Yafa?
Yes, thank you. I absolutely agree with everything that's been said, of course. And I just want to add quickly, you know, I agree. I'm actually hopeful. I think we are in even if I don't sound hopeful, but I am hopeful, because I think that we are living now in times where there is amazing opportunity for cross solidarity between different struggles, between different organizations globally, not just within. And I think we can do that in a very powerful way without also losing sight of the details or the specific campaigns that each struggle would be asking for, right? But the importance of that cross solidarity work. Now, in terms of particularly the labor movement and what it can do, I don't think the BDS movement in general, the global BDS movement, lost momentum, right? Since 2005, it has not lost momentum. Amazing victories. The fact that the response to it is that, you know, Israel and other countries are moving on to criminalize BDS activity and suppress it, speaks volume to the impact that BDS has had globally. So we need to continue with that momentum, right? What happened within the labor movement? Where are we? What needs to be done? And these campaigns really have to be organic. They have to be organic from within and based on each union's specific context, but also obviously in reference to what BDS has asked us to do. Right? So I don't know, I suggest maybe after this meeting, since everybody who's attended would be interested to kind of maybe for Labor for Palestine to follow up and see perhaps if committees need to be, you know, formed after that in order to actually crystallize action to move forward. So I just want to end by saying Israel's apartheid regime doesn't start or end with annexation. Okay, it's a lot. Of course, it's an ongoing thing. And it's not going to stop on its own magically, right? We're not, it's going to happen. We all know that. It has to be forced. We have to force it to abide by international law through boycotts, divestments, and imposing targeted and lawful accountability measures. So, okay, we're holding them accountable to their actions, and we are going to force them to do that through BDS. So we have absolutely no other option, and this is really not up for debate. And I think we do have a strong moment to do that. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Rhea, Sahar, Yafa. Thank you so much for this informative talk, your powerful work that you do all the time, and the provocations that you've left us to thinking about resistance, organizing, and solidarity. And most importantly, reminding us in the words of Khalida Jarrar that the struggle is unending. And so thank you for being here. Thank you for your insights and for provoking us to do more. I also just want to thank the interpreters, Co-op Largo, and the sponsors of this webinar. And finally, I just want to leave with asking all of you to check out Labor for Palestine on social media for more information, and for you to stay tuned for events and actions. And hopefully there's a lot more momentum after today's conversation. So thank you all for being here. Thank you, our listeners, and everyone who joined onto the webinar on this Saturday afternoon. Yeah, have a good day.
Thank you.
Free Palestine is how we end.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.